Nearly 13,000 feet beneath the surface, the water pressure is violent enough to crush solid steel like a tin can. When floodlights first swept across the hull of the Titanic, the world expected to find nothing but a silent graveyard. But those lights revealed something far more disturbing. Among the wreckage, airtight doors sealed shut in moments of pure human desperation, guard secrets still intact, fueling an intense debate over whether history should be rescued or left alone. Today, we cross the threshold of that abyss. Before we descend, go ahead and like this video, subscribe to the channel, and pay close attention. I want you to tell me in the comments, what would you do in the explorer's shoes? Should history be recovered or left untouched? Come find out what the ocean has hidden behind those barricades. Exploring the deep interior of the Titanic is not a simple archaeological mission. It is, in every sense of the word, an operation of extreme risk. The mighty giant, which once cut through the open water, radiating the power of a golden age, now rests fragile and silent on the ocean floor. Its massive steel frame is rotting at an alarming rate, and every movement near the wreck, every subtle shift in water current, can trigger a catastrophic collapse, destroying forever the multi-million-dollar remotely operated vehicles sent to investigate. The image of a four-funneled ocean liner slicing majestically through calm waters beneath a star-filled sky has been violently replaced by a shadowy silhouette buried under thick layers of decay and utter silence. For decades, expeditions were forced to maintain an extreme distance. Our researchers were limited to flying over the massive opening left by the grand staircase, observing only the upper saloons, already stripped bare of their ceilings. It was almost a contemplative kind of exploration. For most people, those stunning exterior images were enough to keep alive the painful memory of the early morning hours of 1912. But the true obsession of engineers and historians was never the exposed areas battered by ocean currents. The real investigative fixation always lay deeper, inside the vessel itself, in the dark, unexplored dead zones. Those zones consist of labyrinthine passages where heavy security doors, locked shut in moments of raw human despair, created true time capsules beyond reach, isolated compartments, submerged in total darkness, where no human eye had looked since the tragic night the ship went down. For many years, available technology simply did not allow teams to risk entering those sealed environments. The fear of losing equipment in the tangles of hanging cables and twisted metal kept anyone from attempting to push into the ship's innermost corridors. History remained locked under thousands of tons of salt water, patiently waiting for the right moment to surface. But the drive to understand the mystery of the sinking always won out. When breakthroughs in engineering finally gave birth to smaller and incredibly agile submersible vehicles, exploration teams decided to push past the rusted edges. Maneuvering slowly through the razor-sharp wreckage with the precision of someone studying a long lateral scrape along the hull, not a head-on collision, the robots reached the massive steel barriers. And when their powerful beams of light crossed for the first time in over a century the darkness of those armored compartments, the shocking reality exceeded anything science had ever theorized. Behind the submerged barricades, the sea had not devoured the details. It had preserved them with a cold, bone-chilling precision. Pushing past the collapsed areas and into the true skeleton of the ocean liner demanded surgical precision and unshakable patience from the exploration team. For the pilots of the remotely operated submersibles, one of the most coveted and terrifying targets was penetrating deep into the legendary Scotland Road. To understand the magnitude of that challenge, we need to understand the architecture of the steel colossus itself. Scotland Road was not just some isolated hallway. It was the main artery of the ship, a wide, continuous expressway that ran nearly the full length of E-deck along the port side of the vessel. During the magnificent days of the crossing, that vast, perfectly lit tunnel was the logistical heart of the voyage. Through it rushed coal-dusted stokers, stewards hauling vital supplies, and passengers heading toward common areas. It was an essential gear in the machine, ensuring that the elegance of the upper decks operated without a hitch. But in the dark, early hours when the ship met its end, that same high-speed artery transformed into a terrifying, nearly inescapable trap. To picture with clarity the exact scene that divers and their robots encountered on the ocean floor, close your eyes for a moment and return to the bridge on that fateful night. The disaster, contrary to what many believe, was not the result of a violent head-on collision. The fatal wound was the consequence of a merciless, prolonged sideswipe that exposed multiple starboard compartments to the full force of the ocean. While senior officers peered through the heavy glass windows of the bridge at the black sea and starlit sky, trying to manage the crisis, water was already flooding the lower levels with a silent brutality, because the sinking concentrated at the bow, tilting the front of the ship at a dizzying angle before the hull could no longer bear the tension and snapped in two. Dragging the stern down into the void, chaos overtook the escape routes. And it was during that slow, agonizing tilt that panic silenced Scotland Road. As the Atlantic swallowed the forward compartments, the black, freezing water began rising uncontrollably along both ends of the long corridor. Engineering crew and security personnel were forced to make brutal tactical decisions in a matter of seconds. The order was to contain the advance of the sea and buy time. The unsettling sound of metal groaning under tension, the clatter of machinery, the echo of confusion bouncing off iron walls, exhausted men fighting both gravity and an ice-cold torrent. The corridor that just hours earlier had represented the pinnacle of human engineering transformed rapidly into a dark, slippery tunnel. The modern fascination with that precise area rested on the hope that cameras might one day find physical proof of that final stand. Decades later, when technology finally allowed the robotic explorers to maneuver through the wreckage of the sunken ball, the tension in the surface control rooms was razor-sharp. Every foot gained represented a real risk of losing the equipment. Pilots had to keep the fragile transmission cables from snagging on debris hanging from collapsed ceilings, where rotted wiring drooped like invisible claws of rust. As they slowly crossed the collapsed entryway, skirting thick dunes of sediment that dissolved at the slightest movement, the lights tore through the absolute darkness of Scotland Road. And at that exact instant, every scientist in the room stopped breathing. Defying the theory that the destructive force of the descent would have swept everything clean, the team did not find an empty, desolate environment. The ocean had not erased the agony of the final minutes. Down there, lit by powerful halogen beams, unmistakable shapes emerged. Heavy luggage carts lay scattered and jammed chaotically across the expressway, frozen in place, untouched, at the exact inch where their handlers had abandoned them in a moment of sheer panic. That silent scene proved that in an instant of pure terror, crew members realized that luxury trunks held no value whatsoever against the urgency of saving their own lives. But the detail that sent a cold shiver straight through the spines of historians was embedded in the corridor's own architecture. As the high-definition lenses advanced carefully, they revealed that the massive fire doors were not resting in their usual open positions against the walls. They had been forced shut and sealed. Unlike the famous lower watertight bulkheads, which were closed automatically by throwing electrical switches on the bridge, those giant barriers on E-deck required pure human muscle. Seeing those solid iron panels locked across the main passageway revealed the true desperation and remarkable intelligence of the crew. Knowing the end was coming with no chance of escape, sailors wrestled in the dark and hauled incredibly heavy structures, risking their own lives to create improvised blockades and slow the water's advance through the corridor. They created the legendary sealed zones, eternal monuments to human courage. The problem is that, physically speaking, if those doors isolated the environment and blocked immediate flooding, the monstrous pressure at nearly 13,000 feet below the surface should have crushed those hollow rooms like fragile paper cups. But there was a brilliant detail that physics had been hiding from us. And it changes everything we thought we knew about the ocean floor. Understanding the absolute brutality of the deep sea demands that we look the physics of extreme depth squarely in the face. When researchers planned the dangerous descent to the wreck, the great, terrifying question haunting naval physicists was direct. Why didn't those armored doors, sealed in the heat of desperation to hold back the flooding, implode instantly under the overwhelming force of the water during the nearly 2.5-mile plunge to the bottom? If you take a hollow metal chamber filled with surface air and drag it violently down into the abyss, the laws of nature dictate that external pressure should crush the walls in a fraction of a second. The steel would fold in on itself, warped and torn like a thin, fragile sheet of paper. When the great four-funneled ocean liner finally lost its fight for buoyancy, the heavy bow plunged first, sinking at a dizzying angle before the hull could no longer bear the tension and snapped in two, dragging the stern to the bottom shortly after. During that tragic, chaotic plunge toward the ocean floor, physics acted in a way no human being could have predicted. The answer that unlocked the mystery of those hidden rooms' survival goes by the name of the diving bell effect. What engineers understood as they pored over unprecedented footage transmitted by the robotic vehicles is that certain exclusive cabins and strategic storage rooms had been so perfectly sealed by the rigorous security doors that the freezing water never had the chance to flood them immediately. Instead of a violent rush of salt water shattering wooden panels and furniture, a mechanical phenomenon of staggering proportions took hold. As the ship descended through the void, plunging into darkness where sunlight has never reached, the force of the ocean outside increased exponentially with every foot of descent. That titanic weight began mercilessly compressing the air trapped inside the well-sealed compartments. The internal oxygen pocket was squeezed to its physical limit, shrinking dramatically in size. But as a direct consequence of that extreme compression, the pressure inside the room increased in the exact same staggering proportion. An invisible equilibrium was created at the very core of a sinking structure. The monstrous force of the confined air inside the room perfectly matched the brutal pressure of the ocean floor pushing against the doors from outside. That split-millimeter equalization of forces acted as a shield. By balancing both extreme tensions, the diving bell effect completely prevented the structural collapse of the beams and the dreaded implosion of the hatches. The entire chamber sank virtually unscathed. The environment came to rest on the muddy ocean plain, preserving everything inside it under extreme compression. It was, in practice, a violent vacuum burial. a mechanical miracle forged at the epicenter of the most famous disaster of the 20th century. And it is precisely at this point in our investigation that I need your full attention. Thus, the mathematical survival of those thick steel walls was only a prelude to a far greater shock. The equalization of pressure prevented the structural implosion, yes, but it paved the way for an astonishing scenario that would deeply disturb oceanographers decades later. The laws of nature and biology on the ocean floor follow an extremely harsh set of rules for destruction. What the cameras captured when the robots finally breached those barriers and entered the darkness defies all scientific logic. The most visually impactful discovery of this entire expedition, the true core of everything we know about the wreck, is about to emerge. And this revelation permanently changes what we believed about the human traces left in the abyss. Advancing the robotic lenses through the gaps of the sealed doors demanded surgeon-level precision from the pilots. A single rough thrust of the propellers could kick up dense clouds of sediment that would take days to settle, completely blinding the cameras and ruining the most anticipated moment of the entire expedition. When the tiny submersible vehicles finally penetrated the isolated environments, crossing the physical threshold of the pressure equalization, the research team on the surface fell into absolute silence. The scene revealed on the high-definition monitors looked as though it had been lifted from a dark and imaginary screenplay. To understand the visceral shock of that moment, which marks the true climax of our entire investigation, you need to understand the unforgiving biological laws of consumption and death that govern the ocean floor. Nearly 13,000 feet down, biology has no rush. But it is absolutely relentless. Have you ever felt that cold chill when you realize nature can be incredibly ironic in its choices? On the outside of those armored doors, the sea devours the structure at an accelerated and violent pace. Battalions of iron-eating bacteria, known in the scientific community as RMS Titanic, are literally consuming the thick walls of the hull. They form those famous melancholy rust formations that look like stalactites, dripping down the sides of the vessel, as if the solid steel were bleeding in the dark. While the metal is slowly digested and turned into fine dust carried off by the current, the wood of the main deck was pulverized long ago and consumed by countless marine microbes. The grand exterior structure, once deemed unbreakable by its proud creators, is crumbling, destined to become, within just a few years, nothing more than a large mineral stain on the floor of the Atlantic. But there was a detail that stopped the hearts of everyone in the control room. Behind the thick fire doors, the hermetically sealed environment had cut off the constant flow of ocean currents, completely isolating those rooms from the great colonies of destructive bacteria. There was no oxygenation to allow the accelerated corrosion to advance. When the powerful beam lights tore through the crystal-clear, silent darkness of those pantries and first-class staterooms, the explorers did not find a scene of decomposition, nor an oppressive tomb of mud. What they found, instead, was an environment mysteriously suspended in time, a genuine time capsule, completely immune to the invisible fury of the deep ocean. The cold white light of the camera illuminated long shelves that, through a genuine miracle of maritime chemistry, had not been consumed, and resting on them, perfectly lined up side by side, were dozens of champagne bottles. They were not shattered by the overwhelming impact with the ocean floor, nor crushed by the immense column of water above. They remained proudly corked, holding in their dark interiors the original liquid bottled before the year 1912. The same terrifying pressure that saved the room had kept the heavy cork firmly pressed into the glass neck in a balance of forces perfectly calculated by physics. Just below, in the lower cabinets, The probe lights revealed stacks upon stacks of delicate, gleaming porcelain plates, stacked in flawless, pristine condition, bearing their elegant lines without a single scratch on their delicate surfaces. As the camera slowly lifted toward the ceiling of one of the sealed luxury staterooms, the team came face to face with the most haunting and moving sight of the entire descent. Defying the brutal logic of the destruction eating away at the neighboring Scotland Road, beautiful crystal chandeliers still hung perfectly from their ornate bronze fixtures. They drifted ever so slightly in the still, clear water, swaying gently with the small displacement caused by the approaching robot, glimmering beneath the artificial light as if still awaiting elegantly dressed passengers for one last dinner. It was the final, undeniable proof of a frighteningly selective kind of decay. The irony of this silent abyss is bitter. The heavy, robust steel, forged in the blazing furnaces of the world's greatest shipyards to be impenetrable, was rotting, surrendering, and vanishing from history. But the fine porcelain, the fragile crystal, the glass bottles, everyday objects that shatter with a simple, careless bump, rested there like untouchable ghosts. Those extremely fragile artifacts survived the long and desperate fall of nearly 2.5 miles, along with the ocean's cruel microscopic predators, completely humiliating the arrogance of the naval engineering of their era. The sealed environment had acted as a grand vault, locking humanity inside a bubble of frozen time. And it was at that moment that a new wave of anticipation gripped the mission. The stunning visual success of those preserved cabins and pantries encouraged the experienced engineers to pursue the ultimate target. They knew that if thin glass and delicate porcelain had survived so beautifully, then objects of monetary value might have held on as well. With nerves stretched to the breaking point, they directed their equipment toward the most protected, guarded, and shadowed location on the entire ship, hoping to uncover incalculable fortunes and forgotten treasures. The problem is that deep, dark salt water has very cruel ways of protecting or obliterating what we humans consider valuable. The quiet euphoria that swept through the exploration team after discovering the ironic survival of the champagne bottles and fragile crystal glasses quickly transformed into a thick, palpable anxiety. For if the equalized pressure and the absence of invading currents had spared items so absurdly delicate, what had happened to the most protected, robust, and guarded room on the entire vessel? The next coveted target of the remotely operated vehicles was not a simple passenger cabin. It was the financial nerve center of the voyage, the feared office and vault room of the ship's purser. For many decades, maritime legends and fantastic myths had fired the imaginations of historians and treasure hunters worldwide. It was firmly believed that at the height of the chaos and abandonment in the freezing early hours of 1912, the overwhelming majority of high society passengers never had time to claim their valuables or simply didn't bother to retrieve their personal fortunes from the locked vaults. The myth held that the submerged room would be overflowing with massive diamond necklaces, heavy gold bars, incalculable stacks of rare coins, and thousands of paper bills from nations across the globe. The imagination painted a true forgotten empire beneath the dark water. But penetrating that specific area required a level of piloting skill that bordered on the impossible. The path to the vaults was a genuine minefield of lethal traps for the tiny submarines. Unlike the spacious, organized pantries, the corridors leading to the ship's administrative area were partially collapsed and severely obstructed by buckled ceilings. Thick electrical conduits, coated in lead and copper, hung in the murky water like a massive, macabre spiderweb, A single snag of the thin fiber optic control cable meant the instantaneous and irreversible loss of equipment worth countless millions of dollars. With millimeter-precise movements, breathless in their surface cabins, the pilots inched the probes forward, patiently dodging razor-sharp beams, until the main beam of light sliced through the darkness of the purser's room. The environment was coated in a thick, morbid layer of gray sludge, but leaning against the deformed steel wall, the massive iron safes rested dark and solemn, like weary guardians of the past. When the high-definition lenses actually closed in on the security compartments, the shock of discovery was immediate and deeply bitter. Some of the heavy iron doors had already succumbed to nearly a century of oxidation, cracking open shadowy gaps into the dark water. Now others appeared to have been wrenched from the inside out, torn apart by the intense deformations of the violent hull fracture, and what the cold light illuminated inside quickly drowned any fantasy of cinematic riches. The harsh reality of ocean chemistry proved its absolute supremacy. The corrosive water had obliterated without the slightest mercy every form of wealth based solely on human trust. The old letters of credit, the stock certificates of great companies, the thick, waterlogged stacks of cash in various currencies, and all paper records had turned into a dark pulp, dissolving into the current as if they had never existed at all. To the vast ocean floor, human money has no value whatsoever. But there was a brilliant and powerful detail that rescued the majesty of that vault. If paper perished in the salt water, its noble materials held on with a fascinating stubbornness. Scattered in the thick mud inside the drawers, small gold and silver coins reflected the light of the robot's beams, completely immune to the appetite of the bacteria consuming the ship. Jewel-encrusted pocket watches, their tiny hands frozen at the hour of terror, and heavy rings rested in perfect condition. Yet the most impressive aspect was not the survival of the pure metals, but the protection around them. The probes captured footage of dozens of jewels nestled carefully inside small wallets and sealed cases made of genuine leather. And it is precisely at this point that the depths deliver yet another one of their cruel biological sentences. The crushing water destroyed the armored structures, pulverized the fine wood, and erased the identities printed on paper. The problem is that, to the utter astonishment of every oceanographer involved in the missions, the animal leather used to wrap those treasures passed through decades of corrosion virtually unscathed. That rough skin, tanned in European factories at the dawn of the 20th century, proved to be an impenetrable shield against the devouring bacteria. The miraculous resistance of the bags inside the vaults seemed like nothing more than a strange chemical eccentricity of the abyss, and this completely changes what we know and what we feel when we descend into that ship. Because the discovery of leather's immunity prepared scientists for the most haunting, painful, and deeply human experience found anywhere on the ocean floor, hidden inside the silent staterooms. The discovery that animal leather survived intact inside the flooded vaults might, at first glance, seem like nothing more than a technical curiosity for naval engineers. The problem is that this unusual biological immunity swung open the heavy doors to the most quietly devastating sight found anywhere in the wreck field. If you ask any veteran submersible pilot or any scientist who has had the somber privilege of descending nearly 13,000 feet below the surface, what is the most haunting thing about the sealed rooms? The answer is always the same. It is not the grandeur of the monumental hull split in two, nor the black void of the empty grand staircase. What truly shakes the human mind, with an emotional force that defies description, is the ghostly surgical preservation of leather clothing. To understand how these objects became the sole witnesses to the end, we need to understand the simple, primitive chemistry of that era. In the early 20th century, shoes, work boots, and heavy travel trunks were made with genuine leather, subjected to an intense and rigorous tanning process. That factory treatment submerged the animal skin in baths loaded with acids and compounds called tannins, designed specifically to prevent the material from rotting. And this completely changes what we know about the cycle of biological consumption on the ocean floor. Because when the ship plunged violently into the darkness, taking with it all the humanity that never found a spot on the too few lifeboats, those tannins acted as an incredibly powerful chemical shield. The predators and bacteria that rapidly consumed the cotton clothing, the silks, the woolens, and even the human bones simply could not tolerate the toxicity and acidity of the tanned leather. The material was flatly rejected by the ocean. When the high-definition cameras illuminated the dark mud floor inside the sealed baggage areas and small isolated staterooms, researchers came face to face with a true, untouched, submerged sanctuary. The physical bodies of the passengers and the heroic crew had vanished decades ago, dissolved by the composition of the salt water. There are no recognizable human remains scattered across the rusted floor. But there was a detail that shattered the silence and emptiness of that vast space in an overwhelming way. Left behind, at the exact and precise position where they fell under the weight of the water, dozens of shoes rest perfectly aligned. The powerful halogen lights swept across the floor blanketed in thick gray sediment and revealed heavy work boots belonging to the furnace crew, side by side with the delicate shoes of first-class passengers. The ocean dissolved the lives, but respected the geometry and position of the farewell. The cameras captured images that squeeze an immediate, profound ache from the chest of anyone who watches, reminding us of the immense fragility of human life. Pairs of shoes rest symmetrically together, marking with photographic precision the exact last inch where a human being stood before being taken. They are small and eternal silent monuments, entering those cabins shielded by the pressure equalization effect, where the fury and constant flow of water did not scatter the belongings. The sensation is not that of exploring a destroyed machine. The undeniable feeling is that of intruding into a guest room where people rushed out frightened into the long corridors on that cold, starlit night, leaving behind their packed bags and their shoes neatly arranged beside the bed, perhaps expecting to return once the officers got the situation under control. That ghostly presence radiates a sadness so dense, so tangible, that it is not uncommon for explorers to cut the microphones in the surface control rooms in pure and silent respect. Every sealed leather trunk that appears on the screen is, in truth, an intimate testament, belonging to someone who never saw sunlight again. And it was at that moment that the wonder of investigation and the victories of engineering gave way to a conflict of colossal proportions. As contemplating those small leather tombstones, perfectly preserved in the most intimate spaces of the ship, ignited a moral debate that struck the entire world squarely in the heart. With the upper steel levels rotting and the giant skeleton threatening to collapse for good, the world's leading experts face the ethical limits of their exploration. Forcing entry into these last barricaded spaces to save what remains has collided head-on with the human right to eternal rest, creating a silent and ongoing tension at the heart of the international community. Every new steel door breached or every gap invaded by a submersible robot immediately reignites a deep and painful international battle. The discovery of those luggage carts and those perfectly aligned shoes, which we just witnessed together, I placed the scientific community before its greatest ethical abyss. We have the modern technology and the structural capability to enter. The problem is that having the technical ability does not automatically grant us the moral right to violate these deeply intimate spaces. On one side of this complex legal battlefield stands the company that holds the legal exploration rights to the vessel. Its experts and historians argue, with a strong dose of practical reason, that penetrating these sealed zones is the only possible way to save the physical history of that voyage. The steel giant is yielding rapidly, consumed relentlessly by bacteria. Estimates point to the inevitable collapse of the entire structure within years, reducing it to an indistinguishable rust stain on the ocean floor. For them, our recovering the artifacts preserved inside the vaults and cabins is an urgent mission entirely focused on saving the memory before the sea erases everything completely. But there is a detail that weighs heavily on the other side of the scale. Across that invisible boundary stand renowned oceanographers, and most importantly, the descendants of the passengers who lost their lives in the freezing early hours of 1912. For these bereaved families, the sunken ship is not an archaeological mine, nor a testing lab for submersible vehicles. It is, above all scientific value, a grand and untouchable cemetery. They firmly demand that the barricades remain exactly as they are. They argue with great emotion that forcing entry into those isolated compartments is a violation of the dignity and the silent sanctuary of people who never had the chance to escape the dark water. The undeniable truth is that we are racing against a cruel biological clock. While humanity debates intensely over who holds the legal right to touch the relics of the abyss, the marine ecosystem continues its silent, patient work. The final decision to open or to keep sealed those last steel doors carries the monumental weight of defining our own humanity. The great ocean liner on the ocean floor is not just a lifeless metal structure. It is an incredibly dynamic environment, still guarding its final secrets beneath the heaviest darkness. The hermetically sealed doors and the hidden compartments we explored today prove that the relentless violence of nature was not capable of erasing every trace of humanity left behind. The problem is that with the accelerating, imminent collapse of the upper decks, our time is running out. Within just a few years, these submerged vaults will be gone forever. Faced with that irreversible scenario, I leave the great question to you. In your view, does science hold the moral right to break open these last locked doors to rescue history? Or should the ocean floor be respected as the definitive boundary? Leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for crossing this abyss with us. Until our next journey,